Hello and welcome to this Institute of Economic Affairs video with me, Annabel Denham. The IEA is producing excellent content, podcasts, videos, webinars, on everything from coronomics to carbon zero and classical liberalism. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel or Podbean and check out our IEA Daily Bulletin to make sure you never miss an episode. Today I'm joined by a distinguished panel of guests: Philip Salter, founder of the Entrepreneurs Network think tank, Nick Rollason, partner and head of business immigration at the law firm Kingsley Napley, and our head of political economy, Dr. Kristian Niemietz. Thank you all for joining me. The UK has spent the best part of a decade with senior politicians who were hostile towards immigration. This was most acutely manifested in the net migration target, which was repeatedly set and repeatedly missed. Prior to the shutdown, we were in a unique position to shape our immigration policy post-Brexit. As Philip has previously written, if you were to invent an immigration system from scratch, only a lunatic would come up with the bureaucratic mess we have in the UK today. Does this therefore give cause for quiet optimism? There are elements to the new points-based system that will encourage those who favour liberal immigration policy, though the irony now is that, for the first time and thanks to the coronavirus, we may meet that net target of tens of thousands for the first time, with all UK visa application centres now closed. But can we offset the damage of ending free movement? How do we create an immigration system that fulfils our economic and social needs? When this crisis has passed, will immigrants find it harder to move to the UK? Philip, I'll come to you first. Have we reached a tipping point in the debate? The first 10 medics to die of coronavirus were Black or Asian. The definition of low-skilled has turned into the definition of key worker, people who stack shelves or work in hospitals and care homes. That said, the UN Secretary General has raised concerns that the crisis has brought about a tsunami of hate and xenophobia. How, if at all, will this pandemic shape future attitudes towards immigration policy and, in turn, perhaps shape reforms?
I think that's a really good question. It's hard to know for sure. I mean, I think what we can say is that it will change attitudes. I mean, we've seen that in the past recently, let's say with the Brexit vote, which in itself seemed to temper some of the kind of anti-immigration sense because people felt that that had kind of had some impact on kind of meeting what they were looking for. The Windrush scandal in polling seemed to change people's attitudes towards immigrants as the government completely messed up on that front and trying to send UK citizens back to other countries. So I think there will be an impact, but to what extent that impact will spread across low-skilled workers across kind of the economy as a whole, or will just be focused more on, let's say, the NHS and care workers in general. I think one thing that has been shown, I think Kristian's kind of written a bit about this, is the focus has very much been on the NHS, and I think a lot of the policies to come out will focus on the NHS and how that as an institution can be supported, but not necessarily focusing so much on other businesses. So there is a risk that that this is just becomes a policy in terms of immigration policy, just to ensure that the NHS is held up and that it doesn't really look at other businesses. In terms of public attitudes in general, within recessions, I think there's research showing that, and assuming we do go into some form of recession, that people become less open to immigration during economic downturns. So that's certainly will be a factor at play, and you can expect an element of kind of xenophobia in general across the population. But there's also the question of how the general attitudes across a population actually transmit into policy, and that's not always the case. I mean, you could argue that what happened during Blair time, there was probably an element of kind of xenophobia still around and that was expressed, but didn't necessarily translate into policy because you had a leadership then that was much more kind of open and to kind of liberalisation on that front. So maybe it's worth looking at kind of elites and what they think. And I think there, if you look to people like Dominic Cummings, who obviously has a lot of influence on this government, their particular focus is on highly skilled migrants, and particularly scientists and individuals that they think will be critical in terms of leading kind of, let's say, kind of tech revolutions, or things like AI, which obviously he's spent a lot of time blogging about. So I don't think we can necessarily assume that this will lead to a more liberal immigration policy, and particularly if we're still focused on numbers and numbers become the key thing. Of course, this is assuming that we're back to a situation where people can move freely around the world. I mean, if we're not back to that system, or until we're back to that system, this won't be an issue, because people won't want to or won't be able to travel anyway. So it won't be a major concern.
Nick, if I could just come to you, it'd be interesting if you could give a brief run through of the main points of the new immigration system, and perhaps respond to Philip's point about whether is there too much focus on tech businesses and highly skilled immigration. You know, who do you think the winners and losers will be from January 2021, when the new points-based system comes into force? And while we would view the ending of free movement as net negative, are there other elements to this new system that will mitigate against some of that harm?
Yeah, thanks, Annabel. I think the first thing to say about the new immigration system, and this is something that has not really played a huge part in the public debate about it, is that actually when it does, and if it does come in, if we come out of the transition at the end of the year, and this comes in January, is that if you compare it to most immigration systems around the world, the UK's future immigration system will be one of the most liberal. So I don't think we should forget that as a start, because, you know, by getting rid of two of its main planks, which are the limit, so the numerical limit, and secondly, the resident labour market test, under which employers have to check the resident labour market and be able to justify why they're hiring somebody from outside the UK. By getting rid of those two things, you know, it sort of opens up the doors quite massively. So we mustn't forget that in the context of the broader debate about, you know, who the winners and losers are. So against that background of a very liberal immigration system where every job could be filled by anybody from around the world, which, you know, if the wider population become aware of this, there may be some backlash against this as a policy mechanism. And that risk might be heightened by the current pandemic and the backlash and more protectionism if there is a massive economic downturn, which we expect, and there is more concern about protecting native workers' roles and jobs. Then we need to be careful. But certainly the new system, you know, creates a very clear pathway for those who have a job offer to come to the UK. It doesn't cover those who don't have job offers generally. They will be covered by the very small numbers of schemes that cover the highly skilled, the global, what's called global talent, the innovator visa, and those sorts of which the numbers are very small in those sectors. So it's really the bulk of it will be those who have job offers. There's obviously the salary level, the threshold 25,600, under which you can't sponsor people. So there will be those in the lower skill roles who can't be sponsored. But the system does open up quite a lot of new roles that can be sponsored by lowering the skills threshold to RQF3. So you'd be surprised to learn that actually a restaurant manager can now be sponsored. A head waiter can now be sponsored. So some of the losses that we expect to be seen at the lower end of the skills levels are going to be offset by actually enabling employers to sponsor more people in sort of managerial responsible positions at the lower level. So yeah, there clearly are losers, and we're expecting hospitality, construction, the care sector to be quite badly affected by that. The question of what is a low skilled worker versus a key worker, again, a big issue. We're seeing that massively in the current crisis of who the key workers are. But you know, the hospitality industry will be massively affected by this. And one of the big challenges, I think, is how to make the immigration system work for government policy in terms of levelling up. I think one of the big issues that we foresee is that the current, on the basis that they don't get completely sidetracked by COVID, the government policy on levelling up and infrastructure projects, particularly in the north, are not going to be sustainable if we can't find the skills to help to build railways or to do these big infrastructure projects. And the difficulty and challenge is, how is the new system going to fit in with those longer term government policies of levelling up? So I think that's the big challenge, I think, for the government, is to think about that. And also, when this big review of what happened with the pandemic, and is our care system fit for purpose? Again, how do we make sure that we have, the staff that we need to actually staff that care system to a level where we'd be happy with it going forward, as it changes? So I think there's some really big policy challenges as to how the anticipated future ecosystem actually fits into those new big policy areas that we're going to be looking at in the future.
Sure. I mean, one thing you said there that really struck me was around the sectors that will be hardest hit. They're the ones that, the businesses that are going to be hardest hit by coronavirus are the ones that are dependent on immigrant workers. So, you mentioned hospitality. When those businesses come out of hibernation, are we really going to tell them that they can't get the access that they need to workers, from abroad in order to recover from this crisis? And, as you say, how are we going to fill those temporary gaps? Kristian, what's your take on this?
Well, it is true. In the new system, there is no regular route for low-skilled employment, just as there is no regular route for self-employment. And that is the big change. It's a major liberalization for medium-skilled non-Europeans. For them, it will be far easier to come in than it is now. That's a major liberalization, and that's a good thing. That's because the skills threshold is lowered, because the salary threshold is going to be lowered, and the numerical target is going to be dropped. And as Nick already mentioned, the resident labor market test is going to be abolished. That is a pointless box-ticking exercise, which just adds costs to the hiring process. That means that if you're an employer, you have to advertise a job domestically first before you can hire a non-European immigrant. But of course, in practice, how are you going to prove that you haven't found a suitable domestic applicant? This is completely subjective. It's just a pointless box-ticking exercise, which adds costs. In that sense, the new system is an improvement, but by ending freedom of movement within or for people from the European Economic Area, it does mean that you also get rid of an easy way for low-skilled, unskilled people to come here. And I don't think we will see a big change in attitudes here because of the corona pandemic. It's you're quite right. At the moment, these people are seen as the heroes of the crisis, the key workers. But then it has long been the case, there are detailed attitudes studies on this, that people have fairly positive attitudes to a lot of these jobs. It's just that in the abstract, almost everyone is hostile to low-skilled immigration. If you ask about, if you use the generic term low-skilled immigration, if you ask, do you think fewer low-skilled immigrants should come here? Almost everyone says yes. But if you replace that generic term low-skilled with specific jobs, then suddenly you get a much more mixed picture. That's when people think, oh, well, hang on, that sounds that's a useful job. I've got no problem with people doing that. They may not add massive amounts to GDP, but nothing wrong with that. And that divide has always existed. And you don't get that on the opposite end of the spectrum. If you ask about high-skilled migration in the abstract, it's super popular. If you then use specific jobs, consultants, doctors, whatever, you get the same results. So those jobs and those types of immigrants are popular in the abstract and mention specific roles. Or low-skilled, it's only popular once you do mention specific roles, but that doesn't change the fact that as soon as you talk about low-skilled migration in the abstract, it's extremely unpopular. And this is going to change now.
So it's really, in some ways, a question of terminology. Philip, could you perhaps sort of discuss who you think the winners and losers will be looking at the new points-based system?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Nick has said in terms, and also what Kristian said in terms of it being a general liberalisation, and potentially could, under normal circumstances, lead to a lot more people coming over and it being more efficient, particularly for those outside of outside the EU. Obviously, the losers are EU citizens who can't move freely to the UK and can't, build a life without a job offer. From an entrepreneur perspective, I think one thing that I think isn't really thought enough about in this is someone coming over as essentially low skill, but then moving into becoming higher skilled in the process of kind of almost like a kind of apprenticeship in an area, just one area, but this is reflected across other areas, something like the UK bar scene. So the UK, it's fair to say, is probably, or London specifically, is the best place in the world for bars and for restaurants and things and things like that. The bar scene is completely dominated by Eastern Europeans in terms of you look at the top kind of cocktail bartenders in the UK. They've all come over from Eastern Europe. They come over very low, like relatively low paid. They wouldn't be able to come over anymore. They work as what's called a bar back and then work their way up, and then before long they're traveling the world and earning a lot more money than anyone in a think tank earns. And that process is one where they come over, where they have that opportunity as Europeans to come over, and obviously not everyone makes it, and there isn't really a demand in the UK for that sort of thing for cultural reasons. People don't like serving people that much in the UK, it would seem, at least aren't as good at it. And it's areas like that where the UK is going to be much diminished by this, because they will go to other places in Europe, and an area where we're currently the best in the world at will become bad at comparatively, and we'll see kind of centres of excellence, I suppose. And it isn't just the bar scene. Another area would be somewhere like UK fashion, something which we've led the world in a long time, but we're not training people to work doing the kind of manual labour side of it. And a lot of that's being outsourced, but the fashion industry itself has a huge demand for things being done locally for various reasons, but also due to wanting to get things done quickly and having quite a tight input into the garments. That's an area where they'll be locked out of the job market, and the UK will be diminished in fashion, like an area which the UK has traditionally been extremely good at and has benefited once again from Eastern European labour. So I think there's lots of sectors where we've built up a world-leading kind of advantage. I think there's dozens and dozens of them, and suddenly overnight, effectively, we won't have those advantages anymore, and slowly we'll lose our position. That said, obviously, the system does, the winners, for example, are anyone looking to employ young people. The new system will allow young people to stay in the UK after they've graduated, and so they're going to benefit from it. And also employees looking for young talent are going to benefit from more kind of young people staying after university. So I think on net, it could be a lot worse than it's proposed to be, but undeniably some entrepreneurs or some individuals in certain sectors are upset about it, and kind of rightly so.
Yeah. I mean, Nick, I'll come back to you if I may. I mean, if we look back to sort of 2008, when the Labour government started to phase in the points-based system for non-EU migrants, and it was based on assessing individuals' income, education levels, language skills, but eventually whole routes were shut, and the process was made purposely more complex to deter applications. So as we look to January 2021, do you harbour any concerns that this sort of thing will happen again?
It's possible. I mean, we don't, the new points-based system isn't really a points-based system in the way that the highly skilled migrant program and the Tier 1 general program, which effectively allowed people to come based on their attributes, and which was subsequently shut down because of concerns that people were arriving without a job offer and floating around the labour market doing nothing. So I think that the the main plank of the system, which is the sponsored worker part of the system, will remain. And I don't see that is likely to change. I think what you will potentially see changes in and schemes being closed or amended is the innovator visa. It's one of the schemes that replaced the entrepreneur visa last year, which has been particularly unsuccessful for all sorts of reasons, and it's coming for a lot of criticism for not being a really valuable route into attracting people into the UK to come set up businesses here. So I think that may change. I think what we will probably see is the expansion of the global talent program, again, trying to attract those super highly skilled people, which is really the government's obsession on sort of tech people and people bringing science and engineering to the UK. I think that will be expanded, but I'm not expecting that a major economic downturn, which people are predicting quite rightly, is going to end up with us closing these routes. What the routes allow you to do is to probably turn the tap on and off by adjusting some of the levers that exist in the system, such as the salary level, the skill level, and so on. And you might see some changes there, which governments have previously used to sort of manage the numbers coming in. So you could move the skill level up and down, you can move the salary levels up and down, you can play around with these levers to kind of, if you think that the economy needs less migrants, then you can probably play around with it. I don't expect to see routes being shut down wholesale, but some tinkering around with some of the routes and hopefully some improvements to things like the innovator visa, which is really a very useless immigration work stream at the moment.
And I'll stay with you, Nick. I mean, are there schemes, are there policies from across the world that you would like to see here in the UK? Were you able to cherry pick and make the reforms of your choice? Where would you look for inspiration?
Well, people always say that Canada has a wonderful immigration system, but it's a very different economy, and it's a very different population makeup. So it's very difficult to try and transpose some of those schemes sort of highlights to the UK, because it's a really different environment. And I think people often say, "Oh, let's copy this, that, and the other." There are some some good schemes around the world. I think the key thing for us is to allow the schemes that are existing to be more data driven. And I think other countries like Australia, for example, have much better data on labour markets, which enable governments then adjust the points thresholds, to adjust various things more quickly. So they're responding much more quickly to labour market demands. And I think that's been a really major policy failure in the UK, in its inability to get data quickly on what's going on in the labour market. So I would say probably my biggest bugbear would be, get better data, collect better data, and use it in a better way to be able to inform immigration policy.
Sure. And Kristian, what's your sort of take on that? What's your biggest bugbear, but also what would you cherry pick from overseas?
It's not so much an immigration system as such that I would import from elsewhere, but general governance structures that make it easier for countries to absorb large numbers of immigrants. In particular, a much more liberal land use planning system, so that the supply side of the housing market is much more responsive, and generally fiscal decentralization. And that is the reason why Switzerland, for example, finds it much easier to cope with, in proportional terms, much larger numbers of immigrants. They have, firstly, a very decentralized tax system, which means that areas which experience a large influx of immigrants also experience, by the same token, an increase in tax revenue, simply because the taxes that those immigrants pay stay in the area. They're not all centralized at the national level, which is what happens here. And that's why people on the liberal side here often have difficulties when they make the case that most migrant groups are fiscal net contributors. Yes, that's technically true, but it doesn't always feel that way, and it's a fairly abstract element. That's the case, which is much easier to make when those net contributions really stay in the area where you can show these people do not just consume public services, they also pay taxes. And it's for that reason that we've been able to build this road here and this new school here. A decentralized tax system makes that much easier. And of course, there's examples from around the world of more liberal housing markets. There's, for example, much of Texas, the city of Houston has had enormous population growth. I think in their case, not because of international migration, but more because of domestic migration. But they've had more or less stable house prices nonetheless. And these examples do show that a housing cost explosion of the type that we've experienced here over the last 25 years or so is absolutely not inevitable. And it is possible to keep housing costs low and affordable, even with much greater rates of population growth, whether that's because of immigration or some other source, some internal source. It is absolutely possible to have a responsive housing market. It also helps if you have insurance-based healthcare. I'm aware that we're not going to get that, but nonetheless, as a point of principle, you often hear the argument here that migrants are a drain on the healthcare service. That's because even though it is again true that most contributors taxes then they consume in the form of public services, including healthcare. But again, that's a fairly abstract element. It's much easier to make that case when you have a system where the same people who use healthcare also pay for their own health insurance premiums. And then it would be much harder to claim that somebody is somehow a drain on the healthcare system. There, it's perfectly clear. These people, yes, of course, they use healthcare. They go to the doctor, they go to the hospital, but they also pay insurance premium by the same token. Just as you have more people coming in, health insurers also have more contributors, and therefore it's clear that is a complete non-issue, a complete non-starter. And maybe one specific thing that Switzerland has done right the whole time is that even though they've signed up for freedom of movement, despite being outside of the single market, they've been part of the free movement zone, but they've policed the boundaries of that quite rigorously. Free movement in Europe has never been completely unconstrained. There have always been limits. It's always been the case that you can only move around freely as long as you exercise treaty rights, meaning that you either work or study or live of independent means. It's just that Britain, most of the time, hasn't enforced those boundaries. But it is possible to remove someone who doesn't exercise treaty rights, someone who doesn't work or study, and Switzerland does that. If you're a European citizen who moves to Switzerland, you have to show that you have a work contract already. You have to register, and you have a time-limited visa initially. And it is possible to expel someone who doesn't do that, and you don't qualify for benefits straight away. It is possible to enforce those boundaries. What I would have done, ideally, after the EU referendum is I would have said, we're going to keep free movement, but we are going to use those limitations. We're going to enforce those limitations. We're going to address some of the concerns, but once you have once those legitimate concerns are addressed, there's nothing else to do. Apart from that, there's nothing wrong with free movement.
So Philip, cast your mind back to 2016. Do you agree with Kristian that that's what you would have done? And could I ask also whether there are elements of other visa systems that you would like to import here in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, it would have been good to do it maybe before 2016 as well. I think in general there's often a false dichotomy between having kind of control of your borders and having a liberal immigration system. To me, they probably go hand in hand, and we don't have particularly good data or records of people coming into the country and leaving the country still. And you'd think that we should, have a much more kind of data-driven approach to that and have a much more kind of control in that respect. Kind of coming onto things that we could do better in this country. I think there's no perfect system, but one area which some other countries do better at is the bureaucracy around it. And it's an area actually where the UK seems to be getting worse in terms of increasing visa fees, and things like the NHS surcharge and other things. And you can see why these things have been introduced, and you can understand that maybe there's an advantage in doing it because of the kind of rhetoric around the NHS and the things that kind of Kristian has emphasised in having a system which is not insurance based, that people do feel that other people might be taking advantage of it, despite the evidence being the contrary. But at some point, these tiny kind of interventions and tiny levels of bureaucracy that seem quite small at the start suddenly start on the margin putting people off, particularly around the costs of visa applications. And it's not just once, it's also when you want to move on to another visa, or when you want to renew your visa, it's a cost again. This is being either paid by businesses or more likely employees in lower wages, and ultimately this pricing people out of coming to the UK. So it's not enough just to look at the headline figure of, it's been reduced to 25,600. You have to add all the additional costs as well. Another thing that's is often very frustrating for entrepreneurs that we speak to is the amount of time it takes to apply for visas and the kind of bureaucracy involved there. I don't know to what extent it's adhered to, but for example, in Chile, they have it's 15 days for their tech visa that they have. I think it used to be even more generous, where they were effectively paying entrepreneurs and people to come to the country just because of where it sits geographically. But just doing things quickly and efficiently would go a long way towards kind of helping attract people. And if we were known as a country that could process these things quickly, then it would lead to a lot of businesses wanting to work out of here, to move their headquarters over here, and for it and for people wanting to move as well. So I think there's elements of the bureaucracy that still need to be fixed and would require kind of proper government reforms and the Home Office and massive Home Office reforms. I think there's definitely an appetite from businesses for those processes to be improved significantly.
Sure. Nick, how do you think we can roll back some of the bureaucracy and perhaps make the cost more manageable for businesses or the individual?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with what Philip's saying about the cost of visas. I think they're prohibitive. I think the UK is probably the most expensive country in the world from an immigration point of view for individuals to be sponsored to work here. So if you think about, actually pounds and pence, it costs businesses about £8,500 to actually bring somebody into the UK to work on a work visa. When you take into account the NHS charge, when you take into account the skills charge, the visa fees, etc., and when you then bring in a whole family, you're talking potentially up to almost £15,000. So it's really prohibitive, and that needs to change. I think that the skills charge as a justification for taxing employers as a sort of Pigouvian tax for stopping immigration doesn't really work, and it doesn't also feed into reskilling British workers, because actually the funds are just backfilling cuts in government in government departments' budgets. So I think the cost issue is really big, and I think that because it's so prohibitive on smaller employers and tech startups and entrepreneurs who want to hire people, it's really prohibitive to stop. It's stopping those businesses from growing. So I think that's a really big issue. I think in terms of the bureaucracy, I'm not sure that I fully agree with Philip on the speed issue. When you go to speak to other lawyers around the world about how fast, how quickly people can get visas, the UK generally comes pretty much at the top of the league for how quickly you can get some visas. But bear in mind, there is a very high cost for doing it at that speed. So I think the UK can do it. It's just a question of whether they're willing to do it for less. And I think that the bureaucracy it's getting better. The Home Office are now talking about, because they're expecting a huge surge in the number of businesses that are going to need to sponsor workers who were formerly hiring EU nationals in skilled roles. And there's going to be a massive surge in applications for sponsor licensing. They are now looking at some new systems to enable them to be able to monitor employers better, reduce the bureaucracy, make application for sponsors more easy and much more online and digital than it is at the moment, where you have to send in physical documents. And using technology to be able to monitor sponsors without having to send people out, boots on the ground, to go and bang on employers' doors to talk to them about what they're doing on compliance. So I think there's some positive signs, but I agree the bureaucracy really needs to show that the UK is investing in making itself very attractive for businesses coming here, which I think is going to be a real challenge.
Great. Well, regrettably, that's all we have time for. Thank you for watching, and thank you to Nick, Kristian and Philip for taking part. For more information on the history of pandemics, the economic and regulatory impact of coronavirus and much more, please visit www.iea.org.uk. Check out our YouTube channel. We're putting up a new video on there every day, and subscribe to IEA Daily to stay updated on all of our activity. Thank you.